Hi, and welcome to this week's Wu Wei Wisdom Life Lessons teaching. It's great to be back with you all. This week is part one of our new Inner Child mini-series, where we'll be going back to basics to help you understand the foundational principles around the inner child work, and inner child healing. We also have a huge back catalogue of long-form inner child teachings for you to enjoy and delve into, and I will put a link to those in the show notes. But today we are beginning with the question, what is the inner child? Okay, David, so what is the inner child?
Right, great question, Alex. The inner child is a label, a name we're giving to a part of your mind. Now, this is where a lot of people will get slightly confused. You may already be labeling this part of your mind. You may call it your ego. You may call it your subconscious mind. You may call it your emotional mind. You may call it that little devil that sits on your shoulder and talks to you. And that's the part of the mind that I believe, after all my work, the most effective label that you can give it is the label of an inner child, because that allows you to change your perception on how you view and work with that part of your mind.
And so where does the term inner child come from?
Because I think for me, what happens is you have a wonderfully mature person sitting in front of you who's been very successful, very switched on, very attuned, but they have this little part of their mind, particularly around emotional situations, that acts like a child, that has the characteristics of a child's view of the world. Unfortunately, then, this little child kind of rushes over and takes over, rushes in front and takes over. And so the mature, intelligent person is almost trapped behind the inner child. And the inner child takes over the thinking and the actions and the beliefs. And there's an internal tug of war going on inside of them. This confuses a lot of people, hence why we're doing this Back to Basics series.
And so you briefly mentioned characteristics, and I know we'll talk about that in a lot more detail in a future teaching as part of this series, but typical characteristics in terms of, you say, the characteristics of a child, what would they be?
I think the number one characteristics is extreme, black, white, yes, no, right, wrong, good, bad. Like a child sees everything, doesn't see the nuance, doesn't see what we're teaching, the Wu Wei, the middle ground, the flow to get your energy moving. It has to be right or wrong, good or bad, very judgmental. We call it in our model CCJ, criticizing, comparing, being judgmental. And the child will do that about themselves or about other people. Another very important characteristic of the inner child is it sees value and worth coming externally, that it always has to work hard. It's like oxygen. It needs someone else to reassure it, give it value, give it worth, tell it it's doing well. It like a knife to the heart if it tells it it's not happy with. And that's one of the main things. And the most important thing, so many you see, the most important thing are emotions. And here's one of the great mysteries. And this is why I like the term the inner child as well. Because if you have a physical child, if you have your own children, you'll see this, what I'm talking about. And your inner child acts in exactly the same way. So the inner child will use their emotions. I would say manipulate. And I know a lot of people find the word manipulation a kind of a negative word, but if you have children, you know that they use their emotions to manipulate. Oh, mom, dad, oh, I don't want to go to bed now. It's not fair. Look, my friends, their parents let them treat them that way, this way. You're not. And so they're very manipulated using their emotions because they believe that if they use their emotions, in the end, they'll get what they want. They'll get their own way. And just to put a pin there, this is another thing you'll hear the inner child say. It's not fair. It's not fair. And when you hear that little voice inside of you saying, it's not fair, that's your inner child saying, it's not the way I want it. So when things aren't the way it wants it, the inner child will use emotions. They might use very strong red light emotions that you may call fear, being scared, anxiety, depression, shutting yourself down, blaming yourself, chastising yourself, self-sabotaging yourself. It will use all those emotions to try and get the outside world to change to get what it wants. The problem is the inner child will never want to accept that it creates the emotion. Hence, one of the most important teaching in the Wu Wei model is you are the creator of your emotions. You are not the victim. And that teaching brings a kind of a classic response from my clients. They'll say something like, I intellectually accept that. I know other people can't transmit emotions into my body. Emotions don't float around the room like a virus and attack me. But, and then they'll use the but word. And what they're saying is, I accept it, but my inner child doesn't accept it. And there you see, I've just give you an example, which we'll go into in far more detail in this series, of what the inner conflict, the tug of war is, because you know something, but the inner child does not want to accept it and will use emotions. I'm sorry to go on for so long, but it's a really important subject.
So what I've heard you say, David, is that our inner child, that part of our mind, has very childlike qualities. Yes. And behaviors, and it uses emotions that it is creating as a way of trying to communicate, to express itself.
Yes.
And so whenever we experience a negative feeling, negative self-talk, being judgmental, critical about ourselves or other people, that by and large is coming from our fearful inner child.
And that really, Alex, is so important that people don't understand, even when we say it in our videos. So if you take one life lesson away from this little short video we're going to do, is to think about this. When you experience immense fear, being frightened, shutting down, being anxious, whatever name you want to call it, that's why I prefer to call it a red light. When you experience that extreme, powerful red light, this is your inner child screaming out for attention, screaming out for someone to go and be with them and listen to them and guide them through what they perceive to be a really difficult situation. And so many of my clients over the years have done the opposite. They haven't turned inward to speak to their child, to guide their child. They've ignored it. They've shut it down. They've tried to placate it. They've tried to eat too much, drink too much, gamble too much, spend too much, whatever it is, trying to feed the child. It's like as if you see a child crying and you want to give them a donut and another donut and another donut, instead of asking them why they're crying. And that's where a lot of my clients have gone wrong.
And that really is the inner child healing, inner child work, inner child reparenting that we will be looking at in next week's teaching. David, I just want to dig around a little bit more on the qualities of the inner child and how then that inner child fits in with the rest of who we are, the rest of our mind, the rest of our being. We always spend a lot of time in our teachings talking about all the negatives, all the ways that the inner child creates problems for us, the ways it can be very extreme, very black and white, as you say, a very kind of childlike view of the world. But does our inner child also have positive qualities, like as children have positive qualities, playful, creative, inquisitive?
Absolutely, Alex. I think I've been doing this work for nearly 45 years now, and every inner child that I've had the privilege to work with my clients is quite simply amazing. They have so much determination. They are so strong. And remember, when I'm talking about the inner child, I'm also talking about you, because you are the inner child. And so the qualities of them is just immense. They're so creative. They absolutely amaze me. I've been down the golden thread with literally thousands and thousands of clients over the years of doing this work. And I've never yet to meet some kind of a monster, some evil inner child, some demon. It's totally been the opposite. I've met a child who is totally creative, totally determined, but stuck. And that's one of the things when I was in China and studying, that's one of the things I kind of like, the way that they describe it. They think about it like a kernel, like the stuck part of your mind, like the middle of a nut, and it's locked tight, 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 tight. And so it doesn't trust anyone. It doesn't want to trust anyone. It doesn't want to be hurt. It doesn't want to be deceived. It wants things the way it wants it. It thinks that's fair. It wants justice. It wants equal. It wants all these things that in reality, in our real life, for instance, it doesn't want anything to go wrong. It doesn't want to be disappointed. It has very high expectations. And it wants to be perfect. That's a great example. How many times in these videos have we talked about that? The inner child wants to be perfect, because then it will get what it wants. It thinks that if it's perfect, everybody will be in awe of it. It'll be on a high pedestal. It'll be future-proofed. It will be able to walk through life in a nice, calm way. Everybody will be saying, "Oh my goodness, look at this person. She's so wonderful. Now, that's like an inner child, isn't it? That's like a child. Wouldn't a child like that? That's why Disney over the years have made millions. They've spoken to the child and they've painted these wonderful images of Cinderella and magic kingdoms and things like that. And the inner child wants to be a prince or a princess. The inner child wants everybody to adore it. The inner child thinks it deserves that. Then the problem comes. It meets the reality of the real world. It shuts down. It builds protection. See, the inner child, one of the inner child's greatest things, I'm talking a lot, Alex, I'm so sorry. But the inner child's greatest thing is emotional protection. And how can you be emotionally protected from emotions that only you create? So the inner child's very confused. And when he gets confused, it doesn't want to be shown up. It doesn't want to be embarrassed. So it locks itself down. It shuts itself down.
So just to recap, David, you mentioned the golden thread. And for listeners who don't understand that concept, the golden thread process is the therapy model you use with all of your clients to work with their inner child, to get down to the origin of their emotional issues and imbalances, so that you can essentially help them unblock their inner child from these kind of extreme states of emotion and extreme states of thinking, and move their inner child to a place of more peace, creativity, joy, love, inquisitiveness, all those other determination, all those positive qualities that the inner child also has.
Yes, I think the golden thread technique is very powerful, and it's something you can practice for yourself. You don't need anyone else to do it. And so the principle, as we've said, if you are the creator of your emotions, if you're creating fear, then you have to find out what is the thought or the belief that's creating fear. in this context, we can say, what is the inner child struggling with? What is the problem that the inner child has? So you start at the very high level, the emotion, and then you ask why. Why am I choosing to create this emotion? Why? And that will bring you down to one of the issues the inner child has.
And so, David, I'm wondering, this blockedness that you say, as adults, we often struggle with our inner child rather than are able to celebrate it because it's blocked, because it's fearful, because it's comparing and criticizing. My question is, have we always had an inner child, and at what point does it or did it become blocked?
Well, in my empirical experience working with clients, it seems to me the age of around 6 to 9 years old seems to be very important. Not exact, could be 5, could be 4, it could be 10, but around 6 to 9 seems to be the optimal time. My understanding of that, and it'd be interesting if you think about this, that's the time when a child is fully emotionally developed and using their emotions, but their cognitive reasoning isn't quite developed enough. So they're still seeing things fair or unfair, just, unjust. It must be you, it must be me. This is not right. This is not the way I want it. But they haven't got the logic or the cognitive reasoning to work that through. And this normally means that somewhere in their family, that somebody should sit down and work it through with them, but there's no one there. They're in a dysfunctional environment for whatever reason. And so they're left to their own devices and they come up with childlike solutions. One of the main solutions is to blame themselves. And that's what I call the vow. And I'm sure we'll talk about this when we start to really dig down into these lessons even more. The vow is when the inner child says to themselves something like, it must be me. There's something wrong with me. I'm not meeting other people's standards. My parents aren't happy with me. I'm not as good as somebody else at school. I'm not top of the class. I didn't get on the sports team. I'm being bullied. I'm being harassed. And so they turn it on themselves. And that's normally the first thing. Then, of course, like a child would do, they then try and protect themselves. They then shut down. They bottle up. They're not in their flow. This is how I would say. They're not in the Tao. They're not flowing. They're not on their path now. They're in avoidance mode. They're ducking and they're diving and they're trying to please people. They're trying to placate. They're trying to keep themselves small. How many of my clients have said, I want to just keep myself small. I don't want to stand to my full height. And that really goes against then, we will talk about again your Shen, your spirituality of who you really are. And so again, you see that internal battle.
And so I guess what you're saying is that when we're very young, when we're born, we have this part of our mind and we are that young child and we are carefree, we are open, we are trusting, we are inquisitive, we are soaking everything up with an open mind like a sponge as a young child. But then something happens that causes us to doubt ourselves, to doubt the world and to blame ourselves, to make that vow. We do that as a young child, but then from that point onwards, even as we grow, mature to a teenager, to an adult, we carry that self-blame, that self-doubt within our psyche, within our inner child now, because we are no longer the physical young child. And that it becomes the predominant characteristic and driver for our inner child as an adult.
Particularly around areas in their life, such as relationships, such as development, careers, anything that will involve emotions or what other people view them as, what other people think or say about them. So the inner child then becomes very protective and very in defense mode. And I often say in the videos, the inner child plays the victim, poor me. And because it's trying to It's better the devil you know. Let's think of the worst case scenario. Let's think of the worst, so we're better prepared. So these are the type of things that we're going to talk about, that the inner child will convince you this is the right way. But all the time, it's trying to lessen the impact of emotional feelings, when all the time it creates the emotional feelings. And that's the breakthrough teaching, really.
And I think, David, for a lot of individuals who are beautifully sensitive individuals, it can seem like their life becomes very dominated, their mind, their thinking becomes very dominated by their inner child, wants, needs, and expectations. But we are more than that, I guess, small part of our mind. I'd like you to explain a little bit more about how the inner child fits into the wider dynamic of who we are in terms of the Taoist teaching of who we are as a oneness.
Well, the inner child is very important because it's an important chapter in your book. So the Taoists would think about like your early childhood, and it's a thing, it's experiences, it's situations, it's people that you have met on your journey. So the Taoism would say your childhood, and this is why I do these teachings, does not define you. Does not define you unless you want it to. So it's learning those lessons and moving on. But unfortunately, we never learned those lessons. And so that's why we're working with you now, so you can go back and relearn those lessons. That's why we call these series life lessons. They are life lessons, that people aren't always the way that they should be. Parents aren't always the way that parents should be, whatever you think they should be. And so it's learning those lessons and how you deal with it. And if you haven't, this part of your mind keeps rereading the same chapter. It's stuck in what we call the carousel of despair, like a hamster on a wheel, going round and around and around. And never think that your inner child's lazy or doesn't work. Your inner child is working at full speed, running very quickly, but it's going round and around with the same story. And unfortunately, then what happens is that story becomes very familiar, becomes almost comfortable. And so it's very hard to persuade the child to get off the hamster's wheel, because although it doesn't work, and here's another characteristic of the inner child, it loves the familiar. It loves what's known. And so even if the known doesn't work, it will stay on the known. And it will say something to you like, well, it's easier. Let's stick with what we know. Better the devil you know. Have you said that to yourself? Better the devil you know, rather than trying something else. So again, you identify this inner struggle that you want to go on a different road, and the inner child says, no, let's stay on the carousel.
So I can see how this kind of inner child development from when we were young, this timeline of development through our life. And as you say, if we don't resolve the life lessons that we should have learned in childhood because we weren't mature enough to do so, we will continue repeating these patterns. But David, you also talk a lot about the part of ourselves, which is Shen, the spiritual side of us. Almost like there's the inner child part of us and there's the Shen part of us. Can you explain a little bit more about how our spiritual side or our authentic self sits alongside and works with or doesn't work with the inner child?
Yeah, so the Shen that I would talk about is the spiritual side of you. Now, I don't want you to think I'm talking about some supernatural religion, angels, crystals. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a very natural part of you, such as the inner child is a natural part of you. You have this Shen. Now, you may call it another word, and using the words is very important. You may call it your inspiration. You may call it your inner knowing. You may call it your sensitivity. You may call it your creativity. You may call it your authenticity. So it's got many words, and I would call it your Shen. And it's your Shen that brings you to study, to look at our videos, to read other books, and to go and know, instinctively, there's another way. You're not reaching your true potential. You're not in your flow because you're dragging along the inner child. It's like an anchor that's pulling you back. And that's when I look in the camera and I say, I believe you're awesome, amazing. And I'm not just saying that, I believe it because you've managed so fantastically with pulling the inner child along with you and resistant at every moment.
But this is the inner child when it's in doubting mode, when it doesn't value itself, when it's blaming itself. This is the out of balance inner child.
That's
because if our inner child was balanced, was in Wu Wei, in that kind of balanced, harmonious mindset, it wouldn't be being dragged along. The Shen, our authentic self, would be working with the inner child as almost like a team rather than, as you describe it, as like a heavy anchor.
That's right. And that's when you're in your Wu Wei, when you're in your flow, when the inner child and the Shen are working together, as you say, like a team. And that's what when we're talking about the healing, that's what we'll be talking about. How do you achieve that? So the Shen is this, I don't want to use higher part of you, but this part of you that really wants to do this work, that really wants to strive, that really wants to reach your potential. And the inner child is the one that's the doubtful Thomas, that's always worrying. Well, we got to be careful. We got to watch. What happens if somebody doesn't like us? What happens if they think this? What happens if they think that? And then overall, instead of being driven or led or grounded in your Shen, you are grounded in your inner child. So it's almost like you've created a separation in your mind, what the inner child beliefs and thoughts and what your Shen is. And most of my clients are led by the inner child, and I want those to come together so they're working together as a team, as you said, Alex.
And that's really, David, what we'll be talking about next week when we talk about the inner child healing and the inner child reparenting work, is how we bring the Shen and the inner child together and almost have the Shen acting as the parent to the inner child.
Well, that's what I was going to say. That's one of the reasons why I like the metaphor of the inner child. Don't think it's perfect, but I think it's a very good metaphor for help you spiritually and personally developed, because you can think about your mature mind as the spiritual parent and the inner child as your spiritual child. And it's your responsibility, accountability, no one else's. And this may be difficult for you to hear, but it is your responsibility to parent your inner child in the way that they've never received parenting, the way that they've never been sat down to, talked, guided, listened to, questions answered, someone to hold their hand, someone to give them a hug, someone to tell them that they're loved, that they're worthy. And that has to come from you. But that's what we'll talk about like next week. And it's a very important lesson.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Well, I really hope this has given you a good introduction and overview as to what your inner child is. As I said at the start, we have so many more teachings on the inner child. So do check out the show notes where I will add some links there for you. If you have enjoyed the teaching, please do let us know and perhaps share it with someone else who you think may also benefit from it. David works every week with clients all over the world by Zoom video call on the inner child and inner child issues and how their inner child is struggling. If you are interested in learning more about David's consultations, I will also put a link in the show notes about those as well. And finally, please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We produce new teachings every week, and we would love to share your journey with you. Bye-bye.